Welcome to The Right Atmosphere, podcast for writers, brought to you by Atmosphere Press, the only publisher that puts rewarding and meaningful author experiences above all else. I'm your host, Hayla Alawi. On this episode, we'll be talking about the ins and outs of speculative poetry with our guest, Wendy Van Camp. Poet Laureate Emerita Wendy Van Camp is a dynamic voice in speculative poetry, blending cutting-edge technology, astronomy, and daydreams into her work. Her talent has earned her nominations for the Elgin, Puigcart Prize, Riesling, and Dwarf Stars Awards. Wendy's poems, stories, and articles grace journals worldwide, such as Starline, Sci-Fi Cooist, Worlds of IF, and San Diego Poetry Annual. She also contributes to Indie Author magazine. Wendy is the editor of Eccentric Orbits, a science fiction poetry anthology. As a member of SFWA, SFPA, and IBPA, and co-chair of the SFWA Poetry Committee, Wendy is a passionate advocate for the speculative community. Her debut poetry collection, The Planets, was nominated for the Elgin Award. Discover more at wendyvancamp.com. Thank you for joining me, Wendy.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. You're obviously a very accomplished poet. I know you've both written and read your fair share of poetry. So, first, I think it's really important to establish, can you explain to us what exactly is speculative poetry?
Well, the way I explain it best is think of science fiction and fantasy authors. These same tropes and ideas can be written in poetic form, and it doesn't matter what the form is. The idea of speculative poetry is that it has speculative ideas. So anything you can imagine in a science fiction book or a fantasy book, you will also find poetry versions of those same tropes. And that's basically what speculative poetry is.
So it seems like content-wise, there's just this difference in maybe setting or the base content, but the structure and the verse and those kinds of things tend to stay the same between the two formats, quote unquote, traditional poetry and speculative poetry. Are there any key difference between those two types of poetry in terms of how they're published or how they're marketed, or is it really just the difference comes down to the actual content?
Well, there is a speculative community for poetry, and it's worldwide. We are sponsored by several associations. SIFWA, of course, is one, where I basically am now. SIFWA has not accepted poets until 2 years ago. So we are brand new on the scene. And as chair of the poetry committee, or a chair, I should say, I have a partner. Um, we are developing a poetry program there. We have this past year um, basically developed a Nebula Award for poetry, and that goes in
Oh, wow.
effect next year. So it'll be the first time, and this is something people have been waiting decades for, but it now exists, and it will be a permanent part of the Nebula Conference and of the award system. Uh, this year is also the first year there's been a Hugo for speculative poetry. This is temporary. It's only going to be at WorldCon Seattle in 2025. But there seems to be some interest among the admin. And when WorldCon comes to Anaheim in 2026, we will push again to try to develop a Hugo Award then and push, hopefully, to make it permanent. There's many people that would love to see a Hugo for speculative poetry as well. But that's just the start. We actually have our own award system for speculative poetry. Most of it is through the SFPA, which is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. They were developed by Suzanne Elgin, and basically we've been around, gosh, I think 75 years, a long time, long before I ever joined their halls, I'm afraid. But we have several awards that a speculative poet can apply for. There's the Riesling, both for a long and short poem. A long poem is a poem with lines more than 50, but less than what would be considered a chapbook. The short form is actually 11 lines up to 50. And then there's a Dwarf Star Award, which I is kind of in my Balwiki, being a sci-fi coup poet for the most part. That's 10 lines and less. The awards are supported by anthologies, so the people who make the final cut, the finalist list, get to be in the anthology, so their work is published. And we also host events where they can read their poetry, and it's put onto YouTube so people can see it in the public. We don't do a lot of in-person events just because our poets are so scattered along the planet from all different countries. And it's not really easy to get people together in one place. I am hosting an award for the Dwarf Stars this year for the first time at EagleCon, and they're sort of sponsoring us loosely. So it's nice to have an actual university showing interest in speculative poetry, including it in their science fiction studies. And it's all very exciting, really. Um,
Yeah.
let's see, there's beyond awards, we also have our own special markets. There's magazines such as Starline, which is the flagship publication from SFPA. They pay our poets. We also have Eye to the Telescope, also a paid publication, which is free to read online. So if you go to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association's website and click on Eye to the Telescope, you can actually read some very excellent speculative poetry and give yourself an idea of what poetry is. And for those who want to know, the website is sfpoetry.org. And we are now an official nonprofit organization, by the way, which is quite
Oh,
wonderful.
yeah.
It took a bit of work too. Um, but anyway, that's kind of what it is. I think one of the differences between literary poetry and speculative poetry is that we in the speculative community tend to pay our poets. Flat out,
Mm.
we value them. This is their work. This is how some of them make a living. And we believe in paying something, even if it's just a token payment. And if a magazine doesn't pay, usually there'll be no fees to submit, and they will also do everything possible to promote the poets within. For my publication, which is Eccentric Orbits, which is published by Dimension Full Publishing, which is a Canadian small press. I basically do everything humanly possible to get awards for my poets, and our anthology typically has more awards than even the bigger magazines like Strange Horizons or Clark's World or whatever. The good poets are coming to my publication, but they know that I take care of them. I submit them for every award that I can. I submit them for push cards. I make sure they're all submitted for Rieslings. I definitely make sure they're submitted for Dwarf Stars. Any way that I can promote them as an editor, I do. I also put them in the science fiction IMDb. I forget the acronym, but there's actually a place that lists everyone's clips in one place. It's all linkable. And if you're any kind of science fiction writer, it's really behooves you to be there because it gives possible editors or project coordinators an official place to see your work that's official, and that they know that you can't spoof them on that. It's kind of in black and white. So I always felt it was important to put all my publications of science fiction nature, of course, because I do write literary work as well. But
Oh,
all my
yeah.
science fiction work goes into the DB, and I just feel that's something that's important. Doesn't cost me anything, just costs me time, and anyone can join it for free. So if you are a writer You maybe have, even if you just have one credit, you can establish a profile there. And I do recommend that speculative writers and poets do so.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, I'm particularly fixated on what you said about um, speculative poets are actually getting paid for their work as a standard rather than as a bonus, which,
Not everybody, but yeah, I would say compared to literary poets usually are never paid, and they
right,
usually have to pay a high fee just to be considered for a magazine. I'm saying $20, $30. We don't believe in that in the speculative community. If there is a fee, it can't be more than $1 or $2. Otherwise, people would shun you. You would not get poets. And
right,
I actually believe in that because our work is important. We need to be seen, but we need to be compensated. I mean, you wouldn't ask a plumber to come to your house to fix your sink and say, "Oh, you need to pay me to come." No, it doesn't. That doesn't seem right to me anyway.
right. Yeah, so I'm very fascinated by that. I also, it sounds like the institutionalization, let's say, of speculative poetry is relatively new with the establishment of these new awards. Is speculative poetry itself a new phenomenon, or is it just the recognition that is new?
No, it's actually it goes back many, many centuries. Think of a classical poem like Beowulf.
Mm.
Beowulf is about a warrior going out to kill a dragon. Is that not speculative? Think of
Right,
Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad. Does not Odysseus go and battle sirens and gods? And that is also speculative. So, speculative poetry actually has a very firm grounding in classic literature. Um, but it has kind of been sidelined. I know many literary places kind of poo-poo us. We're kind of the second-class citizen or the stepchild, so to speak.
right.
And I know when I first came on the scene, most of my battles was just to explain that we existed. It was like Horton Hears a Who with the dandelion, and the poets were in that dandelion going, "We are here, we are here, we are here." And it just took basically going to each men one at a time around the country and explaining that to them. And they went, "Oh, we didn't know you existed," or whatever. But they did open their arms, and slowly but surely, we built readerships, panels with poets to do their readings, to talk about poetry. And it's now considered kind of a hot topic in on the convention scene. And you usually can find at least one speculative panel at each major science fiction convention, if not more. And some places are even running contests. For instance, Balticon in Baltimore, Maryland, hosts a contest for young science fiction authors, but they open it up to adults too. And this is a paid contest. So the winners do win money, and then their poetry is read at the convention if they're not there. I believe one of the prizes is a ticket to the convention if they want to come. But I know I've worked with the poetry um, coordinator there on more than one occasion. I'm one of her judges now, so I'm one of the judges at that particular poetry contest. And I'm very proud of the work. We get poets from all over the world, and it's really just fascinating to read their work. And one of the things I always look for as a judge is if the poem is actually speculative. You can't just put in, "Oh, there's a ghost," and it automatically think this is a speculative poem. That's actually not the case. It has to have a true science fiction fantasy element to it, and or horror, because we do accept horror at Balticon. So but compared to what I do as a judge for IBPA, I actually judge their poetry books for their, well, it used to be called the Franklin Awards. I believe it's now just Book Award or whatever. Sorry, I've forgotten their new name. But that is mainly literary, and
Mm,
it's a very different field. But even there, I see such a diversity of thought that it really heartens me. I think there's room for everyone in books and in literature. And but I would like to see speculative poetry more respected. I know as a poet laureate, I remember reading a poem I wrote about the conversation of a mother and daughter as the daughter was going off to war, but they were dragons.
mm,
And I took so much flack for that. Like, how dare a poet laureate write about dragons? Ooh, the horror.
Jeez. Yeah,
But
right.
and then I was nominated for a Riesling for it. So what can I say? But yeah, it's just we're not really accepted, and I think that's a shame because there's room for everyone here. And just because it's speculative doesn't mean that it doesn't have meaning. Traditionally, science fiction is talking about the future as it relates to us today. So, talking about issues in a way that's in the future or on another planet, but addressing things that are happening with us today so that, our readers can think about the concept and make their own decisions about it. We're facing so many things with AI and the planet and all these. This is science fiction and fantasy are ways for regular people to read about the situation in a way that's entertaining. So, you actually learn about the concept, but then to make your own mind up, or at least to listen to alternatives. Sometimes the work is dystopia and it warns the dangers that may be coming. But sometimes there's things like solar punk where we're looking for a hopeful future, and I'm actually one of those people that believes in writing about a hopeful future, because how else do we as people figure it all out and find a safe way? And I think as a science fiction writer, this is kind of our duty in a sense. But that's just my opinion. So
Yeah, I love that idea though, it's your duty as a speculative writer, and I think there's so much to be said about making room in the literary community for that. Before we say goodbye to our guest, I'm happy to say that this episode is brought to you by Atmosphere Press, the only publisher that puts rewarding and meaningful author experiences above all else. Founded in 2015 by an author and PhD in literature, and devoted to serving authors through editorial, design, publication, and promotion, Atmosphere has sold tens of thousands of copies of their authors' books across 6 continents. Visit atmospherepress.com to sign up for Atmosphere's newsletter, The Launchpad, and to learn about submission opportunities, event news, and free book publicity and writing residency giveaways. So, and you've mentioned a lot of really great resources for learning more about speculative poetry and where you can read not only how to submit that kind of thing or how to determine if that's what you're writing, but also just to read more of that. But I also want to make sure we find out, Wendy, where should our listeners go if they want to learn more about you and the work that you do?
well, as most poets and writers have, I have a website. It's wendyvancamp.com. I'm very active on Instagram, as most poets are, and my handle there is at No Wasted Ink. That comes from me being a haiku poet. I also have a monthly newsletter, which is free. It comes in text, but I also personally narrate it as well as a podcast. You
Mm.
can find that on Substack. That's nowastedink.substack.com. And I believe I have it up on Spotify under the No Wasted Ink handle as well. I call it the NWI, that's No Wasted Ink, Ramblecast. So uh, basically, my newsletter is just me rambling about what was important to me for the month personally. So you kind of get a little insight on the life of a writer and poet. Then I do a writing tip essay, which is applicable to both poets and writers. And at the bottom, I feature my poem of the month, which is one of my sci-fi coups usually, which I illustrate. So, and of course, you can find my artwork, my illustrated poetry at Comic-Con art show each year. So I've been there, oh my gosh, maybe 30 years. It's been a long time.
Wow.
I just came back from the from my train ride, as a matter of fact, from the 2025 show. So it's
Wow.
kind of my pilgrimage to San Diego once a year.
Yeah, you're
But
keeping busy. It's amazing.
I do. I speak at conventions all over the country. Usually, I was at Worldcon in Scotland last year. I'm kind of taking this
Mm,
year off. But I'm at Balticon quite regularly virtually as a panelist. I go to ReaderCon, of course, EagleCon here in LA, and LostCon, which is also in Los Angeles. So I get around as best I can anyway. And of course, I do local poetry events. I'll be in September, I will be at Meet Your Local Poetry Community, where I am one of 4 poet laureates speaking, and that'll be a strictly literary event, but I'm still probably
yeah.
going to slip in a dragon poem. You never can tell.
Well, that all sounds very exciting. And I just want to say thank you so much, Wendy. This was so much just, it was really great to be able to pick your brain on all of this and to give this information to everybody. So thank you again. And thanks to all the listeners for tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Right Atmosphere, the Advice for Writers podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with the writers in your life. And if you're ready to take the next step in your publication journey, visit atmospherepress.com to submit your manuscript for publication consideration or to learn more about writing and what it is that we do. I'm Hala. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.